Hello again, IB Psychology students, and here is my unit of work on how to write the exploration for your IA. As usual, I always start my presentations with a little plug for the book that I co-authored. You can see the two books there for Year 1 and Year 2, available on Amazon. So I have also produced presentations for the other sections of the IA, which I will link below this video so you can look at them all together. Right, now with the exploration, it's only worth 4 marks, so you have to be mindful not to add too many words to this section, because you want to save your words for the other sections, which are 6 marks. But at the same time, you have to do enough to satisfy the criteria for this section. I think this can be quite demanding for students because they do have a lot to say. The IB are asking you to add a lot of ideas and explanations, and it's only 4 marks, so bear that in mind. But at the same time, do look at the mark criteria. You should all have some mark criteria which your teacher should have given you, or you can find on a website, the IB website. Okay, so the first thing you need to do is just state which design you use. Now, you will have used repeated measures or independent measures. Repeated measures, the participants experience both conditions of the independent variable. Independent measures, you have 2 groups who each experience one condition of the independent variable. Now, you need to justify its use without evaluating. So you might say we used independent measures so as to avoid order effects, which you would get with repeated measures. So you might say something about practice effects or producing possible demand characteristics and link it to your procedure. Yeah, so make it contextual, make it relevant to your procedure. Now, the second thing you need to do is clearly state your sampling method. It is most likely going to be opportunity sampling. Do not write random sampling. This is a mistake students do a lot. They think that random means something other than its true meaning. And I've marked many IAs over the years which say things like, we conducted random sampling because we obtained a random group of people. Random is a specific word in psychological research, and it doesn't mean what you may think it means. You will not have used random sampling. Ask your teacher for more explanation if you don't believe me. You're most likely to have used opportunity sampling, as you don't have access to a wider population and it's quick and convenient. That's a good thing to write in your IA, that italicized part of the sentence there. You might use a self-selecting volunteer sample, and you would have to make sure that you reference the advert that you put out asking for volunteers, because you will have to reference everything to an appendix that you say that you used to produce this IA. Clearly explain how you obtained your participants. So you talk about opportunity sampling, but don't just leave it there. Explain how you did it. So we approached students who were present during period 2 in the college room, blah, 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 college common room. Or you might use students as part of who were in your maths lesson. I always encourage my IB students to use one of their other classes, such as their English class, their history class, whatever, because you have a captive audience then. If you go to the common room and try to obtain your sample, there may not be enough people there. You may have people saying, not really, not bothered, don't want to do it. You may end up with a very, very small sample, and it means that your statistics won't be viable. So you need enough, I would say, at least 10 participants per group for independent measures, and maybe, you could have some more if it was repeated measures, or it just depends really on where you obtain your sample. Actually, you can get away with fewer participants for repeated measures because they're going to be repeating the conditions anyway. It really will depend on your college, on which lessons you're in, how many people you are able to find. But I think using students in a lesson is a good idea. Right, this is why you very clearly explain your participants. how many were in your sample, how many per condition if you're using independent measures. You give some relevant characteristics: age, gender, nationalities. Say how many per gender. And these days I would always offer participants the opportunity to put something other than male or female, because we are in a gender fluid time now when people may not necessarily be comfortable designating male or female to their gender. And how many per nationality, because this is something that you can pick up in your evaluation later. Explain anything that is relevant to your sample. Now, a lot of you will be in international colleges. Where I teach, we have a wide range of nationalities, so you can't assume that everyone has the same level of English, but you have to communicate the idea that you were confident that they had a sufficient level of English to be able to understand your procedure and produce their responses. So, for example, some students will write that they have passed a certain level on their English proficiency test. They're all studying IB in an English-speaking college. All lessons are conducted in English. That's sufficient, really. The control of variables is something that has come in the last few years in the IA. It didn't used to be on. And students sometimes struggle with this, and they end up talking about their independent variable. Don't talk about the independent variable here. That's, I've realised I've put variables. There's a typo there, so apologies for that. It's variables, obviously, not variables. Your independent variable is not a variable you talk about controlling, because that's clearly what you are manipulating. It's the other possible extraneous variables that you need to focus on. So how did you allocate your participants to the condition? That's a measure of control, because you are removing possible sources of bias from it. You shouldn't be allocating participants to condition. This is obviously only if you're using independent measures, according to what they look like or their gender or any other characteristics. It should be, in the true sense of the word, a random allocation. You might talk about the room you used, the materials you used, any attempt to control noise, the spacing in the room, anything that's standardized that isn't the independent variable. And this is really important to talk about, because you can pick this up in the evaluation. You can talk about some strengths of your control of variables, but you would really want to talk a lot about the limitations, because your students, you're not professional psychological researchers. You are bound to have not got full control of all the variables in the same way that a professional would. And even professional psychologists can't control every single variable, because human beings are human beings. Okay, you need a list of materials. I would suggest that you present it as a separate bullet-pointed list with a little subheading saying materials. Everything you use to carry out your experiment, from before you ran the procedure to during the procedure to after the procedure, should be included on that list. The number of times I've reading through a student's exploration section, particularly the procedure, and they mention a material that they haven't put in the list, and it's not a good thing to do, because it looks inconsistent. It looks like you haven't thought properly about this section of the IA. So, for example, you might have your consent form, your standardized instructions, your debriefing instructions. Whatever you used, there might be a video, a link to a video, there might be PowerPoint slides, photographs, lists of words, whatever. They should all be in the appendix, and you divide your appendix according to, what seems logical to you and what seems logical in terms of the IA. Put your materials down in the order that they are used in your procedure, and arrange your appendices accordingly. So I would expect the first appendix that you use to be all to do with the consent form and ethics, because that'll be the first material that you will have to use. You cannot be giving out standardized instructions or running your experiment before you get signed consent from your participants. Always write that they signed the consent form. Giving them a consent form is fine, but if they don't sign it, then it's unethical. So you have to make sure that you mention that. You only need to reference your materials to appendix once, and you should appendicize the materials by category. So, for example, you might want all the ethical materials in one appendix, all the procedural materials in another, anything superfluous in another appendix, such as calculations, raw data, that you use after. So it's not, you don't just put materials in the appendix that you use during the experiment. You also have to have materials in the appendix that help you to analyze your data as well. Okay, now it used to be that IB students were marked on the procedure. That's not the case anymore, but if you leave a procedure out, it's going to not do you any favors later on, because you need to pick it up in your evaluation. And if you're picking up points in your evaluation that haven't appeared previously in your report, it can mean that your report lacks consistency and clarity and a kind of holistic quality. So I always say to my students, put a subtitle of procedure, subheading, underlined, and make it like a recipe, step by step, using as few words as possible. So it clearly starts with the participants being informed of their rights and ending with your debriefing note. Your ethics should bookmark your procedure. You start with informed consent, you finish with debriefing. I would write as few words as you can and do it as bullet points. And make sure that everything is absolutely unambiguous. One of the most common things I write on the procedure is, who are they? Who is them? Because students will write, they were given at the beginning of a bullet point. Now, I don't know who I know who they are. They're talking about the participants. But the problem is this has to be replicable. If you gave this procedure to a new person and said, carry out this experiment, they is ambiguous. So you start the first point saying, the participants were given. And then in the same sentence, you can mention they. But if you start with they, it's too ambiguous. I know this seems picky, but the IA is a picky procedure. And if you make anything ambiguous, or you cause the person who is marking it to scratch their head and say, what do they mean? You're doing yourself out of marks that are easily won marks if you just stay clear, stay unambiguous. So, as part of the procedure, state that the consent forms contained information about the participants' ethical rights. I always say to my students, just bung in some ethical guidelines, and then you really are covered, because you've already mentioned your consent form. If you refer to ethical guidelines as well, you're covering yourself. You are showing that your IA is ethical, yeah? It's just a small point, but it's worth thinking about. Okay, so these are comments from the May 2019 Examiner's Report. Again, these comments that are issued every year after every exam session, well, they're pretty much the same every single year. They hardly ever veer from what these comments are here. Okay, so the main issue we can see here is that the lack of explanation. Students seem to be good at description, this is what we did, but they don't often follow through with an explanation, this is why we did it. And remember, you've only got 4 marks here. Why kind of do yourself out of 1 or 2 marks on this section when all you have to do is follow the criteria, explain why did you choose this design, this sampling technique, what is it about these participants that kind of made them appropriate for this particular experiment, etc. At times, candidates confuse laboratory experiment with experimental design. Yes, you don't need to say it's a lab experiment. That's the method. We know it's a lab experiment. The design is how that lab experiment is conducted. Repeated measures or independent measures. It's not difficult. You just need to get it clear in your head. And again, we've got a lack of explanation, superficial explanation. You know, people who are marking your IA are marking hundreds of them. And they're going to get very fed up if you're just skimming the surface and giving a very, what I would call pedestrian, kind of nothingy response. They want to know more about your IA than just, this is what we did, bump, full stop. I'm not going to tell you anything else. Make your examiner like you. Make the person marking your work, if they start to dislike you, I know that marking is supposed to be objective, but people who mark exams are still human beings. So just make it easier for them to like you, because your script might be the 137th script that they've marked. So make their lives a bit more enjoyable. And again, as I said before, the final sentence here, it's useful for candidates to include a procedure, as they need to evaluate this in the evaluation section. Now, why the IB hasn't put this in their mark scheme, I don't know, because if they want you to include a procedure, why on earth don't they tell you? Well, I'm telling you now, put a procedure in, and your teacher should tell you the same thing too. So, to finish, here we are again. I'm shamelessly promoting my 2 books. If you like what you've heard on this video, please press the subscribe button. I am adding videos all the time, all on IB psychology, and good luck writing your IA.